Okay, it looks like we are rolling and we are live now. So, thanks everybody for coming again to, I guess this is our fifth session now on Hegel and Dialetheism. And we were originally scheduled to have Nick Stang give a talk, but he, due to some schedule conflicts and the like, he'll be giving his talk later in November, I think November 29th. And then Richard Dean Winfield, a distinguished professor of philosophy from the University of Georgia, has graciously volunteered to step in for Nick today and to give a talk. And the title of the paper is On Contradiction, Hegel versus Aristotle, Sextus, Empiricus, and Kant. And this paper is coming out in it's chapter 4, right, of a new book, In Defense of Reason After Hegel. The subtitle, Why We Are So Wise. That's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And then the paper that you're reading, Richard, today is already published, though, in a volume edited by Glenn McGee entitled Hegel and Ancient Philosophy, a Re-Examination. I think, as you said, it's chapter 10 of that book. So without further ado, go ahead and we can get started. I think you'd prefer to have the questions saved until the end, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And then I think Graham will moderate the questions. And Graham, I suppose we can do it per usual. I'll keep an eye on the YouTube and you can moderate from within. Okay.
Good.
Yep.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, without any further ado, I'll begin. No principle has enjoyed more abject fealty in the annals of Western philosophy than the principle of contradiction. From Aristotle onwards, almost all philosophers have invoked this hallowed principle to support their philosophical systems or to embolden skepticism of them all. Whether identified in Aristotle's formulation or in Kant's revision, the principle of contradiction has yielded the same outcome. Reason's search for truth has been banished from the territory in which contradiction is encountered. For Aristotle, there are no regrets. The principle of contradiction is the fundamental first principle of reason, and only on its basis can philosophy achieve any positive results. For Sextus Empiricus, our refuge from dogmatic philosophy depends upon it. The principle of contradiction is the implicit foundation of his ancient skepticism, which can thereupon confidently suspend judgment whenever argument can be shown to fall into contradiction. For Kant, the principle of contradiction is guarantor of both logical coherence and metaphysical restraint. Although the principle provides certainty of consistency rather than truth, it saves us from following our natural inclination to think the unconditioned and pretend that we could attain truth through reason. Only Hegel calls into question acceptance of the allegedly irrefutable principle of contradiction. He suspects that any skepticism that depends upon it is not skeptical enough, whereas any philosophical system that pays it homage cannot possibly be valid. The faithful embrace of the principle of contradiction finds its classic expression in Aristotle, who turns to it tellingly in pursuit of a first principle of reason. To know truth without qualification, Aristotle acknowledges, philosophy must be the freest, most sovereign discipline. Instead of being captive to any particular condition or perspective, philosophy must uncover what is most universal and fundamental. For nothing can be comprehended in truth unless that without which nothing can be or be known is grasped. To overcome bondage to given phenomenon and given standpoints, philosophy must uncover that which is presuppositionless, that which is by nature rather than by convention, that which is immediate rather than mediated by some contingent condition. What is immediate can serve as an ultimate foundation for being and knowing, provided it not only rests on nothing else, but is that from which all else emerges and can be intelligible. The pursuit of presuppositionlessness to overcome all contingent mediation entails for Aristotle what he accordingly presumes to be the defining philosophical imperative of finding a first principle, a privileged immediacy that is foundational. This can only be the case on the fateful assumption that immediacy can be something determinate and determining rather than indeterminate. Aristotle acknowledges the difficulty of uncovering a first principle, recognizing that it cannot be derived from any other factor without forfeiting its privileged foundational immediacy. Precisely because a putative first principle is not determined by anything else, but is rather that immediacy mediating all else, there can be no deduction of it from any premises. The only avenue left for validating a first principle is the indirect path of somehow showing that it cannot possibly be disputed. Aristotle advances the principle of contradiction as the first principle of reason because it alone supposedly exhibits this irrefutability. Aristotle presents in Book Gamma of the Metaphysics his indirect proof of the principle of contradiction, quote, that the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect, end quote. He there offers a two-pronged validation, addressing both being and discourse. The principle of contradiction cannot be repudiated because, Aristotle seeks to show, nothing can be determinate, nor can anything determinate be meant without this principle holding sway. Beings relinquish all determinate character without it, Aristotle suggests. For if something can have and not have at the same time and in the same respect certain qualities, magnitudes, or relations, all things become indistinguishable. Instead of something possessing a nature and features that other things do not enjoy, everything is and is not what everything else is and is not. All becomes one, and that one has no determinable character of its own, since it is both what it is and is not attributed to be. Admittedly, Aristotle's principle refers to attributes, as if they themselves were determinate, independently of whether the same subject can both possess and not possess them at the same time and in the same way. Nonetheless, attributes would similarly lose their own determinacy if the principle of contradiction were not applicable to their own specification. For unless each attribute is what it is to the exclusion of what it is not, all attributes become one and undifferentiated. The principle of contradiction, however, is not just an indispensable foundation of determinate ontology, but the basis of meaningful speech of any sort, including any denial of its own validity. Nothing can be determinately meant if the principle of contradiction is forsworn. Without it, any claim would signify both its assertion and its denial, just as every term within any claim would mean both what it is and what it is not. To repudiate the principle of contradiction would be a hopeless enterprise. For without the principle being valid, its denial would equally signify its affirmation. It thus appears that not only can nothing be meant determinately without subscribing to the principle of contradiction, but any argument against it must presume the principle's validity in order to deny it without not denying it. In sum, the principle of contradiction is impossible to escape or deny because, allegedly, nothing determinate can be nor be meant without it being true. Aristotle seems to have sealed his indirect proof and validated his first principle of reason in the only way possible. Its undeniability appears to prevail without depending upon any deductive demonstration, whereas all further knowledge seems to rest upon it, since any other claims can retain their identity only on its basis. Nonetheless, The principle of contradiction does not offer any resources for determining what are the specific subjects and attributes that hold true. Since all the principle of contradiction does is certify that a subject can only be what it is and not be what it is not, it provides no means for ascertaining how being and meaning become determined and what determinations they acquire. Even if determinate being and determinate meaning depend upon the principle of contradiction, it suffers from an empty formality that leaves it unable to deliver any positive determinations of anything else. Ontologically speaking, the principle of contradiction requires supplement by some other principles to provide being with any further determination. Although determinacy may be thought to depend upon it, the principle of contradiction itself appears to depend upon the presence of determinate beings with determinate attributes to which it can apply. If, however, what is can be determinate only by being what it is and not what it is not, how can being develop beyond a self-identity indifferently applicable to each and every attribute and obtain any specific differentiated content? Epistemologically speaking, the principle of contradiction empowers reason to do no more than think the formal identity of independently given contents by certifying them to be what they are rather than what they are not. If this principle is the sovereign rule of reason, reason can only attest to the consistency of externally supplied contents, but never validate their truth, nor engender new contents through reason alone. Reason is then condemned to be merely analytic, incapable of providing any wisdom of its own, nor capable of connecting different contents to one another. It must hand over material cognition to the experience of phenomena and restrict itself to exercises in formal logic and reflections on the consistency of empirical science, given ethical and aesthetic conventions and linguistic usage. Epistemologically, as well as ontologically, the principle of contradiction appears to be a dead end for philosophical investigation. Aristotle does not fully acknowledge these ramifications and instead ties the principle of contradiction to specific ontological claims. He suggests that attributing to substances only contingent attributes is tantamount to rejecting the principle of contradiction, and that this is done by those who reduce being to the becoming of sensible appearances, whose perspectively relative flux has no abiding intelligibility. Accordingly, it might appear that both with respect to being and meaning, subjects must have a necessary essence, and that which occurs is never unqualified becoming, but only change in the contingent attributes of substances. In drawing these ontological corollaries, however, Aristotle invokes understandings of becoming, appearance, essence, substance, and intelligibility, without accounting for their provenance. Presumably, a first principle of reason should be something that can and must be known before anything else can be held true. Can Aristotle indirectly validate the principle of contradiction by appealing to the conditions of determinate being and of determinate discourse, without presuming knowledge of something more than the principle itself? Must he already have in hand a theory of ontological determinacy and a theory of meaning? Moreover, whenever Aristotle points to the looming indeterminacies of being and meaning as indirect proof of the principle of contradiction, does he not depend upon the corollary principle of excluded middle, according to which something does or does not possess an attribute with no other alternative? That any denial of the principle of contradiction undermines itself can only validate the principle of contradiction if either its denial or its affirmation must be true. Does the whole indirect proof thereby beg the question, presupposing the corollary of what it aims to establish? Aristotle may purport to anchor being and knowing on the principle of contradiction, but ancient skepticism of philosophical wisdom depends upon that same principle to suspend judgment of truth, in deference to unquestioned acknowledgement of appearance and custom. Sextus Empiricus gives classic expression to this dependence upon the principle of contradiction by rooting the entire practice of skepticism in uncovering how claims about what is and what ought to be can be countered by equally strong arguments to the contrary. This unceasing unveiling of contradiction could testify to how both being and meaning irrevocably involve the unity of determinacies with their negations. Instead, Sextus Empiricus regards the recurring encounter with contradiction as sufficient reason to refrain from making any assertions, pro or con. Although the suspension of judgment may serve the practical aim of producing the serenity of abandoned inquiry, apprehension of equal opposing determinations fosters theoretical retraction only if contradiction is recognized to stymie any determinate knowledge. What Sextus Empiricus, as well as subsequent skeptics, presume is that Aristotle is correct in maintaining that allowance of contradiction destroys determinate being and meaning, undermining any normative assertions. On this basis, uncovering opposing determinations can suffice to paralyze judgment. To bring every judgment about what is and what ought to be into opposition with its denial, Sextus employs two broad tactics. One consists in showing how normative claims are relative to some particular factor, enabling contrary claims to arise relative to a different factor. Such factors include the type and condition of the knower, the situation and state of the object, and the relation between knower and object. On the other hand, Sextus examines the content of normative assertions and uncovers how that content can be seen to contain its own negation. Instead of regarding this unveiling as verifying the unity of opposing determinations, Sextus regards it as preventing the opposing determinations from having any validity. Kant does the same when he considers how reason, in its quest to know the unconditioned, runs into antinomies. Rather than regarding the opposing determinations to be united in the nature of the unconditioned, Kant joins Sextus Empiricus in disqualifying their joint validity, leaving reason allegedly powerless to know anything that is not relative. Is Sextus, as well as Kant, dogmatically accepting the principle of contradiction? Without paying it unquestioned fealty, can either happily resign himself to opining conditioned appearances, suspending all attempts to get at the unqualified truth? Sextus Empiricus' own critique of any appeal to a criterion calls into question his own reliance upon the principle of contradiction as the ultimate foundation of skepticism. Although Sextus claims to have nothing unquestioned, to leave nothing unquestioned other than appearances, his skeptical practice employs the principle of contradiction as the final criterion for suspending judgment. If Sextus justifies that reliance upon anything else, he would be invoking some other principle whose affirmation has not been suspended. On the other hand, if he endorses the principle of contradiction immediately, that endorsement has no further basis than the sheer being that its affirmation shares with any competing affirmation. Whereas this dilemma leads Sextus to repudiate any reliance upon first principles and upon criteria in general. He uniquely ignores it in surreptitiously depending upon the principle of contradiction. In effect, Sextus, like Aristotle and all his epigones, is unwilling to confront indeterminacy and instead presumes that immediacy can somehow be determinate. The principle of contradiction is accepted by skeptics and dogmatists alike to escape the looming indeterminacy of being and meaning, whereas their acceptance of it as the bedrock of their reasoning involves a fundamental blunder of any appeal to first principles or ultimate foundations. the blunder of ascribing some determinate being to immediacy. This blunder undermines the whole enterprise of foundational ontology, which seeks to give being, qua being, some determinacy. The moment ontology attempts to attribute any determinate character to being, the would-be science of being falls into the confusion of conflating being with some determinate being, since being cannot be conditioned by any particular being without ceasing to be being as such. Being is unmediated. As immediate, being, however, cannot have any determinate character. For the moment something is identified with being, everything else is deprived of being. Being is and can be nothing but indeterminate, which is to say that being is nothing and nothing is being. Although, since Aristotle, thinkers have clutched on to the principle of contradiction so as not to forfeit determinate being and meaning, Sextus Empiricus's critique of the criterion exposes how any commencement of thought or being with a determinate principle cannot help but be capricious. If philosophy begins with any determinate first principle of being or reason, everything that follows is tainted with the curse of arbitrariness. The fear of lapsing into indeterminacy by forsaking the principle of contradiction thus reveals itself to be a fear of truth. Hegel is the first philosopher to recognize that philosophy must begin with nothing other than what the abandonment of the principle of contradiction is feared to leave us with: indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is that with which philosophy must begin. Indeterminacy as that with which philosophy must begin represents the overcoming of all appeal to first principles, as well as to any determinate given. Givens, be they determinations of knowing or of the object of knowing. Only starting with indeterminacy allows philosophy to make an absolute beginning, freed of the dual relativity of addressing some given content with some given form of cognition. Freeing philosophy from all determinate foundations, beginning with indeterminacy, is equivalent to overcoming the opposition of consciousness, whose confrontation with the given would imprison knowing in relativity, were consciousness the ultimate framework of cognition. Further, insofar as philosophy's beginning with indeterminacy signifies liberation from bondage to the principle of contradiction, it promises to emancipate reason from the empty formality to which that principle condemns thought. Although beginning with indeterminacy might seem to confirm Aristotle's fear that only adherence to the principle of contradiction can make determinate being and meaning possible, what follows from indeterminacy is none other than the thoroughgoing refutation of that completely incoherent view. Any attempt to ground determinate being and meaning upon a determinate principle, such as the principle of contradiction, patently begs the question of accounting for determinacy by presupposing a determinacy for its account. As Hegel recognizes, it is totally absurd to attempt to derive determinacy from any determinate factor. Determinacy can only be accounted for by generating determinacy without reliance upon anything determinate. In other words, determinacy can only arise from indeterminacy. Hegel shows just how this occurs in thinking through the logical development from being to nothing, to becoming, to determinate being. This development not only provides determinacy without taking any determinacy for granted, but thereby refutes the absurd claim that determinate being depends upon the principle of contradiction. The initial moves from being to nothing to becoming offer no possible opportunity for any application of the principle of contradiction. Being has no determinate attributes to affirm or deny, any more than does nothing. Being is indeterminate, precisely because it lacks all such specification. As immediacy, being provides no determinate cause or principle for the emergence of any other term. Since any determinate content or determinate procedure for arriving at something else would be an utterly extraneous, arbitrary stipulation. What follows from being can only follow immediately, without any ground or intervening basis, and consist of nothing but the same absence of determinacy. Being is immediately nothing, just as nothing is immediately being. Neither being nor nothing has anything about it that could be susceptible to contradiction, let alone safeguarded from indeterminacy. Nonetheless, being that is nothing and nothing that is being together constitute becoming, and do so through nothing but their own indeterminacy. Once more, what follows does not depend upon any principle, let alone the principle of contradiction. Rather, becoming arises as just what being and nothing are in virtue of their own most impoverished immediacy. Whereas being and nothing immediately comprise being nothing, as well as nothing being, they together constitute a two-sided result that is irreducible to either being or nothing. This third term, becoming, accordingly consists in coming to be, that is nothing being, and ceasing to be, being nothing. Its emergence cannot depend upon the support of the principle of contradiction, let alone any other foundation, for it immediately emerges from what is itself devoid of determinacy. Although becoming is not a determinate being, but just coming and ceasing to be, nothing that is being and being that is nothing. Becoming provides all that is required for determinacy. Once more, there is no need or any possibility of appealing to the principle of contradiction for securing the advance. The very absence of any attribute in ceasing and coming to be leads to their paralysis. For insofar as being is immediately nothing, and nothing is immediately being, coming to be is immediately ceasing to be, and ceasing to be is immediately coming to be. That is, the nothing into which being ceases immediately cancels that cessation by converting into being. Just as the being that comes to be immediately cancels its emergence by converting to nothing. What results is a dual cancellation of the two sides of becoming, leaving being and nothing in an immediate unity. Being that is nothing reverts to being, together with nothing that is being, reverting to nothing. They stand together in the form of immediacy or being, since nothing else mediates their presence. They are both at hand, being with nothing immediately, because nothing but their own indeterminacy makes the process of becoming come to a standstill. Determinacy cannot be characterized by using any determinate specification, since that would beg the question. Determinacy can only consist of indeterminate components, and that is why the being and nothing into whose immediate unity becoming develops are the necessary and sufficient constituents of determinacy. Contrary to the principle of contradiction, determinacy is none other than what both is and is not, being and nothing. Far from securing determinacy, the principle of contradiction blocks the constitution and intelligibility of determinacy. As Hegel's science of logic shows in following out how determinacy gives rise to determinate being, the immediate being of the unity of being and nothing itself undergoes the same becoming that leads to determinacy, rendering determinacy a determinate determinacy, or something. Since being is nothing, the being of determinacy is equally the non-being of determinacy. Accordingly, determinacy involves both reality, that is the being of determinacy, and negation, the non-being of determinacy. The immediate unity of reality and negation, or of the being and non-being of determinacy, is determinacy that is determinately. It is not just quality, but a quality. That is not just determinacy, but a determinacy, or something. Again, the principle of contradiction cannot possibly play any role in accounting for a determinate being. Something has no attributes to affirm or deny, since they would be something themselves. Instead, something is nothing but what something other is not. That other, the determinate negation of something, is, however, itself a something. That is not what its other is to it. Or I should say, let me repeat that. That other, the determinate negation of something, is, however, itself a something. That is not what is other to it. Hence, something and other are each something and the negation of something, namely their other. Thus, not only does determinacy challenge the principle of contradiction, but so does each and every determinate being, every something or other. Although Hegel may be our great emancipator from the principle of contradiction, he does allow it place in the logic of essence, where it arises in connection with the essentialities of identity and difference, and where contradiction itself emerges as that into which the polarity of positive and negative develops. It is of crucial significance that contradiction and its principle comes up in the logic of essence and not in the logic of the concept. The logic of essence develops all the categories in which some determinacy is posited by another, where determinacy is mediated by or relative to some prior determinant. The logic of essence presents the categorical domain of foundationalism, of conditioned being. And it should be no surprise that its categories are those that Kant privileges in restricting knowledges to an objectivity of appearances that is conditioned by the transcendental structures of knowing. The essentialities of identity and difference involve relations, where an essence, that is a determiner of determined determinacy, is at one with itself through contents whose independent existence it nullifies and incorporates. Self-identity here enters in as a relation wherein an essence is reflected in a differentiation that remains wholly internal to itself. As Hegel notes, self-identity can be termed into the principle of contradiction, insofar as it involves a formal unity, in which the specific content of self-identity's internal differentiation is left unspecified by how it reflects itself therein. Just as the principle of contradiction applies to any content whose formal consistency can be affirmed, so self-identity never goes beyond itself in whatever content it is manifest. For this reason, self-identity involves internal difference, but a difference to which its unity is indifferent, even though it contains it. As a result, self-identical factors are diverse, owing their determinate being not to their contrast with one another, but through their reflection into themselves. That reflection as formal self-identity possesses a content that is itself fixed, lifeless, and devoid of subjectivity. Only then can it belong to formal identity, which contains its content insofar as the latter has a consistency involving no immanent principle of differentiation. whereas self-identity excludes any extraneous difference. Contradiction arises when factors oppose one another, but undermine their opposing identities through their very opposition. Contradiction does subvert the terms it opposes, but it does not result in indeterminacy, as Aristotle and Sextus Empiricus suggest. In order for contradiction to arise, determinacies must develop that are what they are through their very opposition, and at the same time cancel their opposition. The polar determinations of positive and negative provide just this relationship. Positive and negative fall into contradiction, since their distinctive identities depend upon their opposition. Yet in that opposition, they play indistinguishable roles. Where something may have indifferently many others, the positive has its essential other in the negative, just as the negative has its essential other in the positive. Neither can be without opposing its counterpart. Yet in and through their opposition, each relates to the other in precisely the same way. As a consequence, positive and negative eliminate their essential difference through their opposition, which collapses. Their contradictory polarity itself, quote, goes to ground, unquote, insofar as their self-annulling opposition results in a relation in which two factors have the same content, once as positing its other, and again as being posited, as ground relates to what is grounded. Both self-identity and contradiction exhibit the two-tiered character of foundational determination, where determinacy is determined or posited by a determiner or positor. Self-identity does so by rendering difference something internal to its underlying unity, whereas the polarity that generates contradiction does so by superseding the equipollence of something and other with an opposition, where one pole reflects itself in what is distinguished from it. What the entire development of the logic of essence shows is that none of these relations can sustain themselves as independent immediate factors that could serve as ultimate principles. Instead, the relation of positor and posited continually undermines itself, insofar as the positor can only play its determining role by being a relation to what is posited. What is posited, as posited, effectively posits the determining character of its positor, such that the positor is posited and the posited operates as a positor. This outcome comes to a head in the final relationship of the logic of essence, reciprocity, which issues from causality. Since a cause is a cause, only by having an effect, the effect is the cause of the cause's efficacy. Cause and effect thus end up both being cause and effect of one another. Although this reciprocal relation has each factor be both cause and effect of its counterpart, rather than of itself, their mutuality removes all difference between them, eliminating the distinction between determiner and determinant. With this development, the logic of foundationalism eliminates itself, giving way to the logic of self-determination, where determiner and determined are one and the same. If universality and conceptual determination fall within the orbit of foundational logic, formal self-identity and the principle of contradiction might retain a stranglehold on reason. Hegel, however, recognizes that the logic of self-determination is the logic of the concept, which signals that universality can be pregnant with content, that concepts need not be empty, and that reason need not confine itself to analytic labors of certifying the consistency of given terms under the governance of formal logic. The logic of self-determination is the logic of a concept because the universal, the concept as such, is a self-differentiating unity. That is what it determines itself to be. Even the most formal universal, the abstract universal in class, even the most formal universals, the abstract universal and class, have their constitutive identity only in and through their particulars, their instances and members respectively. Without these particularizations, the abstract universal and class would forfeit their differentiated unities and become a self-identical one. Moreover, their particulars must themselves be individuated to sustain the plurality, preventing their collapse into the universal. If the universal had just one particular, they would be indistinguishable, and the universal would revert to an immobile unity, losing its constitutive, encompassing, self-differentiating identity. The universal must instead involve both particularity and individuality, even though it is not reducible to any one particular. Particularity and individuality are both immanent to the universal, which is at one with itself only through these determinations of itself. By contrast, formal self-identity is indifferent to the content of its inner differentiation, which is why it can be governed by the principle of contradiction. Universality cannot, insofar as it carries itself over into the distinguishing character of its particulars, each of which both is and is not, since it pervades them all. Moreover, even though the universal's particulars must be differentiated from one another and thereby be individual, their opposition cannot involve contradiction, which would cancel their self-subsistence. The universal does not undercut their independent being and reduce them to posits of some ground. Rather, the particularization of the universal is its very own self, that is, its self-determination. Contra Platonism, which treats the universal as an essence, reflected in derivative, deficient phenomena, the universal has no being apart from its particularization, which is why that particularization is not inessential and why the universal determines itself and not something else. The self-determination inherent in universality is what enables conceptualization to be both synthetic and analytic at once. Because the universal is self-differentiating, concepts are not empty, but develop themselves, generating new determinations whose synthetic connections constitute the very analytic identity of the concept underway determining itself. Reason can therefore provide synthetic a priori knowledge without having to rely upon something other than concepts. Although Kant recognized that philosophy depends upon the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge, his adherence to the principle of contradiction left Kant only able to retrieve synthetic a priori knowledge of conditioned appearance by appealing to how sensible intuition and understanding connect in the constitution of experience. Hegel's logic of the concept demonstrates how reason can escape Kant's appeal to the given, overcome heteronomy, and determine itself. The universal self-determining self-differentiation is what allows concepts to lay hold of objectivity, which, unlike conditioned appearance, is determined in and through itself. Precisely because objectivity is what is in its own right, it can be the proper object of truth and transparent to a reason whose autonomous development can think through the self-development of an unconditioned subject matter. Whereas a thinking governed by the principle of contradiction can never grasp what is conditioned. A self-determining reason can think what is self-constituted. Our emancipation from the principle of contradiction is crucial not just to thinking truth, but to doing right. Hegel makes this manifest in the philosophy of right, where he underscores how universality involves self-determination by showing how the will is autonomous only by giving itself new determination that remains at one with its self-constituting agency. To determine itself, the will cannot just be what it is and remain caught in the immobile fixity ordained by the principle of contradiction. Instead, the will must negate its given determinacy and become what it is not, thereby achieving its dynamic identity as self-determining. In so doing, the will overcomes the empty universality of being unrestricted to any given content and resolves to act, taking on a new aim that is its own self-determination, giving the will a character it imposes upon itself, enabling the will to individuate itself. The will thus achieves self-determination insofar as it exhibits universality, particularity, and individuality. Only by having the same self-determining, self-differentiating character as the concept can the will escape the formal self-identity that plagues Kant's application of the categorical imperative, the enslavement of which to the principle of contradiction deprives volition of the imminent individuation on which freedom depends. As Hegel never fails to point out, the empty consistency that satisfies the principle of contradiction can apply indifferently to any course of action, provided no further limitations are surreptitiously introduced. Willing achieves self-determination, not in obedience to the formal self-identity of non-contradiction, but through the contrastive individuation of the exercise of rights, where individuals interact with one another, determining their own identities as property owners, moral subjects, family members, civilians, and citizens, through particular entitled actions by which they differentiate themselves as autonomous agents. In theory and practice, only liberation from the reign of the principle of contradiction can secure the self-determination on which truth and right depend. Thanks.
Okay, so we have 70 minutes for discussion. Thank you, Richard. That was really interesting. I think I'm going to abuse the chairman's privilege and ask the first question, and then I shall just butt out and leave it to my colleagues present. Okay. So that was a very interesting take on Hegel. I'd never thought of things that way before. One thing you certainly seem absolutely right about this is something that never occurred to me, namely, the logic is meant to be presupposition free. So whatever is going on in the dialectic, at least in the initial parts, cannot presuppose the law of non-contradiction. So whatever is going on, you have to have a story that doesn't presuppose that. And that seems to me absolutely right, okay? And I don't want to take issue with your interpretation of Hegel. I'll leave that to people who know more about Hegel than I do. But I'm dubious about your interpretation of Aristotle. So the question is, what's going on in metaphysics gamma? And this is an exceptionally tangled text. And I don't expect we're going to resolve anything now, because to do so would require us to hammer through the text, which is a rather ugly business. However, I think what scholars agree on is that if you look at the arguments in metaphysics gamma, there is one very long argument. Actually, some scholars think there are two there. And then there are kind of 6 or maybe 7 very brief throwaway arguments. Now, the first long argument isn't a lenchos. That's pretty clear. One of the odd things about the text is that the lenchos disappears in the 6 or 7 small arguments. And what's going on there is a matter for scholars to argue about. But more to the point, there seems to be a slide of another kind between the long argument and the short arguments. And it's this. So in the first long argument, you've clearly got, or supposed to have, an argument that it's not the case that some contradictions are true. which is, his statement of the law of non-contradiction. But what you find when you get to most of the small arguments at the end is an argument, is that the conclusion of these arguments is that it's not the case that all contradictions are true. So, and of course, that's different, okay? So the official statement of the principle of non-contradiction is it's not the case that some contradictions are true, whereas the small arguments seem to want to establish that it's not the case that all contradictions are true. So there's this slide between some and all. Now, if all contradictions were true, then you'd have exactly the kind of indeterminacy you're talking about. But if you look at the official statement, that's not what the law of non-contradiction says. It's that it's not the case that some contradictions are true. And I don't think the mere fact that some contradictions are true would risk indeterminacy of this kind of full-blooded kind, that what you might call the law of non-triviality, it's not the case that all contradictions are true, does. So I don't think that Aristotle clearly slides between some and all in the way that I've said. And I don't think there is anywhere in the text where he justifies the slide from some to all. What's going on here is an interesting scholarly question. Why he slides, but he doesn't seem to justify it. So the upshot of this thought is that you're dead right, that the arguments in the latter part of Aristotle's Metaphysics Gamma, if all contradictions are indeed true, that will give you the indeterminacy you're talking about. But the main argument of Metaphysics Gamma doesn't try to establish that. It just tries to establish that it's not the case that some contradictions are true. Okay, that's my thought.
I mean, I think the arguments that attempt to show that nothing can be or be meant determinately are the key to what Aristotle is attempting to provide as an indirect proof of the first principle of reason. Because if it is going to show that it cannot be refuted, it requires that global argument. I think the other arguments to which you refer are really applications where Aristotle is discussing particular figures. It could be Protagoras. It could be those who want to speak about how everything is really a matter of becoming, or everything is a matter of sensible physical entities. Here we find him exploring how these claims involve departures from the principle of contradiction within a particular domain that then makes that domain itself unintelligible. So I think in a sense they're illustrations on a limited scale, but the real crux of the argument, which is framed at the very beginning, which is the argument concerned with what can be the first principle of reason and how could it possibly be legitimated, is something that revolves around this global indirect proof, which requires that we come up with something that it is impossible to deny. And that impossibility of denial is not going to be satisfied, as you point out, by speaking about how in some particular arena contradictions are problematic. It has to have a very global account. And I think that's what Aristotle is striving for better or worse.
Yeah, well, look, we'd have to hammer through the text of that very long argument, and it's particularly tangled. So I don't expect we're going to resolve this now, but let's just agree to disagree about how you interpret that particular argument, okay? So I've done my bit. Let me take the hands in the order that I have them. I thought Greg and Eleanor had hands up and they've disappeared. Anyway, Tobias, you've got the first hand.
Well, thank you very much for this really helpful and rich paper. And I also like to start with saying thank you for the work on the biology, the book on biology in Kant, Aristotle, and Hegel. This was very helpful for me when I was for my PhD. But now I'd like to start, or have a question, because I found it very helpful to kind of oppose the classic approach, which you referred us to by going back to Aristotle, Kant, and to Sextus, Empiricus, by saying this is a logics of foundationalism. And I think it's very helpful to oppose this logics to Hegel's dialectics, which is rather logics of self-determination. And very shortly in brackets, I find it very helpful that Charles Taylor speaks of the expressivistic approach in Hegel to kind of make this idea of the self-determination process more intelligible, but this is just in brackets. But my question now goes to the, say, metaphysical implications. Because one of the reasons why many people would think of Hegel's Science of Logic to be also a project of foundationalism is that we find strong evidence that he thinks of this to be in an ontological proof of the existence of God. So the rehabilitation of such a proof might play into the cards of, so to speak, of a foundationalistic reading of Hegel. And so this brings me to my question, because if we are to reject, because we find strong evidence that it's not about foundationalism, more about these expressivistic or self-determining logic that we have in the logics, then we have to come up with an understanding of the ontological proof aspect of it, I think. And so this brings me then to my question, because if the ontological proof of the existence of God is not valid because it presupposes the validity of principle of non-contradiction, then how to deal with this? And I think, and this is my question, how would you integrate this into your reading? Because because we have these passages where Hegel alludes to the scholarly tradition of the rational theology, and kind of replaces this. And this is something I think we might come up with. Or would you go in the direction of saying, no, we have to also downplay any sort of, say, metaphysical reading of the logic entirely and go back to a more, say, a non-normative, a non-metaphysical reading? This is basically my question. I hope I'm making my point clear.
I mean, one of the problems, let's say, in Aristotle's ontology, metaphysical ontology, is that in some degree it ends up being an ontotheology, where at least he has to bring in an account of a particular kind of being, namely this highest being, self-thinking thought. It's interesting that self-thinking thought is really nothing other than the element of logic. Because what is logic? It's thought that thinks itself, and thought that thinks itself has no given method at hand at the outset, nor any given object, because the thinking of thinking has not begun its thinking of thinking at the outset of its enterprise. Hegel looks upon this in a way as the elimination of the opposition of consciousness, which depends upon thinking or knowing confronting something other than itself. And that is sort of the assumption, in a way you could say, of all foundationalism, because it presumes that we always have to begin with some given. Thinking is always operating in relation to some given. And if you regard reason or philosophy itself as having to begin by thinking about something other than thought, that is not starting in a logical manner, then your enterprise is relativized in two regards. First of all, you have to make use of a thinking that you're not investigating, because what you're investigating is something different from thought, right? So you're not putting your thought under any scrutiny in thinking about what is. But then you also have to start with some given determination of what you're examining, because it's, minimally speaking, determined as being other than thought, as something confronting with thinking. And you eliminate that relativity when you can't distinguish between thought and its object, which in a way is the outcome of the phenomenological, let's say, immanent critique of the project that regards thinking as always confronting the given, which I think is what the phenomenology spirit is doing. And it shows that enterprise kind of sustained the distinction on which it's based, between knowing and its what it knows. And that leads one to a so-called absolute knowing that really isn't a knowing of nothing at all. It's just the elimination of the distinction between that opposition of consciousness, which gives us what, in a sense, Aristotle thinks of as a self-thinking thought or the absolute. And the question is, can that really count as a God in any real fashion, or in what respect? But I think one other thing regarding to your question is that, Hegel will speak about many different topics in discussing the determinations of logic. And he'll speak about them as in certain respects illustrating those relationships. And I think it's in those connections that talk of God and ontological proofs and so forth come up. Because what Hegel is not doing in his science of logic is developing categories either in the way of traditional metaphysics, where the categories are categories of what is, of some kind of substrate, nor are they categories by which some knower determines the object of its knowing. They're not transcendental categories, in other words. They're not in relation to anything. They simply are, in a sense, what they are. And for that reason, I don't think God makes an appearance in the science of logic, nor does nature. And it would be wrong for that reason to speak, other than in the vaguest metaphorical way, that the logic is God before creation.
Mhm.
Because the logic does not posit, it does not act as a foundation of what is non-logical. And I think if you look at the way in which development occurs, categorical development, being is not a foundation of what follows from it. Being, as the initial, if you want to even call it a category, being is not a beginning of anything at the outset. It becomes a beginning. And what it is the becoming of is only determined at the very end of the development. And only in that course of that development do each of the so-called categories show themselves, in a sense, to be conceptual determinations, which really, I think, doesn't become clear until the concept itself arises, and one sees what it means to speak of a conceptual determination, which is tied to imminent development and the way in which the specifications of something are, shall we say, intrinsic to it. And of course, philosophy is always concerned with, in a sense, exercising a self-determining thinking. Otherwise, as Aristotle would say, we are slaves to some authority of some sort or something external. So in other words, I don't think God makes an appearance in the science of logic, properly speaking. The categories are not about anything. They're not about the structures with which we think about the given. They're not determinations of some totality that we can point to independently of them. They are what they are in their own right. And in particular, being is not a foundation. The determinations that follow from being are not determinations of being. You can't give determinations to being. If you do
you want to come back on that,
transform it
Toby?
into determinate being. Sorry for taking so long.
Sorry, do you want to come back on that, Toby?
Well, I would have to say much more about this, but I'm very happy with what we have now on the table. Thank you. This helps me a lot.
Okay, well, let's keep going and see how
Sure.
much time we've got.
Yeah.
So when everyone's said the first thing they want to say, then we might have time to come back. Okay, Stefan.
Yes, so thank you for your talk. I have one question concerning your interpretation of Aristotle, because you said, okay, Aristotle is looking for, in his metaphysics, being, qua being, or being as such. And when I got you right, you said, okay, and this is in a way indeterminate being. But if we look at the metaphysics, I think it's 1029a, then he discusses this idea. So what is true being, ousia? And then he says, okay, if it's like an undeterminate something, and then we add determination, what would be kind of subject or hypokamenon from the categories, he says, okay, this cannot be the true being because this would be matter, and matter is not being. And then he says, oh no, it's ousia, and ousia is already determinate being. So for Aristotle, it seems pretty clear that being, core being, or true being is determinate being. Ousia is not indeterminate being. And coming into being means actualizing determinations. Matter is not really being. So, and I think Hegel would even agree with it. The idea of determination and indetermination, I think here Hegel rather refers to the potential or material intellect of Aristotle, which in fact is pure potency and non-actuality in the beginning. And then it gets determined by the active intellect and gets determined. So I don't really see your critique of Aristotle and Hegel, especially with Aristotle's God. I mean, the passage you quoted from Aristotle, it's the end of the encyclopedia. He doesn't even comment on it, so he seems to be in total agreement with the nous who can only think itself. So I don't really see that Hegel's idea of non-contradiction is somehow directed against Aristotle, because he seems to be much closer to Aristotle than you suggest.
Well, look, I mean, Aristotle is providing what could be considered a foundational ontology. He starts his investigation with an inquiry into what is. And, you know, as he indicates in book 1 of the Metaphysics, you know, we need to begin by understanding that, in a sense, which is most universal. And we can't understand anything else, properly speaking, unless we understand what will enter into it, and what will enter into everything is going to be what is most universal. And in a sense, that's going to be what pertains to being, qua being. And of course, he's attempting to determine what that is. And he ends up not only speaking about a so-called primary being, you know, which revolves around the determination of substance, but then he also comes into the need to speak of a highest being, a theological being as well. And, you know, I think there are issues regarding the task of ontology, of discussing being, where if you are holding being to being that which is most universal, I think there is a dilemma of trying to give it a determinate being, because then you are no longer speaking about being qua being. You're speaking about a particular domain of being. Now, keep in mind that not only Hegel, but many philosophers distinguish between being and existence and reality and actuality and objectivity. You know, Hegel will distinguish between all of these things, and I think in many respects do so in a way that corresponds to the way in which these terms have been distinguished in the philosophical tradition. That they involve successively, shall we say, more complicated structures. And you could say one is moving beyond being when one deals with reality, as opposed to negation. One is moving beyond reality when one talks about existence. And one is moving beyond existence when one talks about actuality. And then objectivity, right? I mean, these are all terms that get distinguished. They get distinguished in Hegel's logic, of course. And in a way, they all depend, if you want to try to conceive of them in a manner that does not rely on simply pointing to the given and finding them there allegedly, or by engaging in the enterprise of a transcendental philosophy, where one claims that these are the determinations that we put into any object we can know, making claims about the structure of the conditions of knowing in a very direct way, which we're trying to get away from in trying to escape the pitfalls of dogmatic philosophy, which just directly reads off the character of the given. Well, you know, in both of these options that have dominated philosophical history, there is a kind of dogmatism going on, a dogmatic appeal to what is, and a failure to imminently generate the terms one is coming up with and being fully responsible. or equally just dogmatically reading off the character of knowing and regarding it as the foundation, which conditions the character of what can be known. Here we have something else going on. And what goes on depends upon being able to account for determinacy rather than taking it for granted. And you can't account for determinacy if you subscribe to the principle of contradiction. Partly because, as Graham Priest pointed out, that's tantamount to subjecting reason to a given methodological determination. And that is true of the entirety of formal logic. If one thinks that formal logic has anything to do with philosophical reasoning, one is beginning from the outset with a body of formal determinations prescribing how reason is to think about any concept whatsoever. Clearly, a formal logic is not something that can legitimate itself, because it makes all reasoning conditioned by this given recipe of determinations, which apply to any exercise of reason. They can't possibly be criticized. And it's no accident that Kant will point to, a metaphysical deduction of the formal logical categories he introduces as a basis for the categories.
Okay, do you want to come back on that, Stefan?
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Sorry, I keep thinking you're finishing, and then there's a pause, and I jump in. So apologies about that. But do you want to come back on this, Stefan?
No, let the others ask their questions, and perhaps if we still have time, then I come back.
Okay, good. I'll take the hands in the order which they went up. Paul.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks, Richard. I want to sort of just raise the sort of, when it's put in the way that you did it and presented it very nicely, the idea of reason needing first principles is just a very strange idea. And I'm just sort of interested in your thoughts about where it fits in Aristotle and why he would advance that idea. If you think of Aristotle arriving in Athens and the academy and so on, there's all these different things going on, I guess. Still, I imagine there are these stories about Socrates and, what Socrates would do in the marketplace with this type of strange midwifery of, getting people to see that they were committed to incompatible ideas or something like that, and that produces a reaction in most people of thinking that they've got to abandon one of them or something like that, right? So there's that sort of background. And that's encouraging people to think about connections between ideas and what counts as a good reason for holding a belief and all that sort of thing. But what sounds to me like it's in the back of someone's head who takes the idea of reason needing first principles really seriously is something like the ideas that go into Euclid, which were presumably circulating around Athens at the time, right? Because most of the ideas in Euclid's Elements are from geometers who were, a lot of them associated with the academy and stuff like that. And even in geometry, it's hard to see why that idea, that there must be axioms and that the axioms must be self-evident, and then somehow everything else comes out of the axioms, by some sort of derivation. I take it that even in Greek geometry, that was sort of one way in which things were being talked about, but there were other sort of practices of the so-called practices of problem solving, problems rather than theorems, which are a totally different way of doing geometry and so on. Why would Aristotle, if this is what he does, why would someone think that you had to organize all the sort of stuff that was going on around the type of critical, discursive questioning of reasons for holding beliefs and things like that. Why would one want to run that together with this idea of, if it does come from something like, the axioms of geometry, and what would be available? What directions could you take if you didn't go in that direction?
I think, Aristotle's great teacher, Plato, in the Republic, in the section of the divided line, rather explicitly, I think, criticized the approach of Euclid and others who take, you could say, formal logic or deductive reasoning as being that which can arrive at truth. And it's pointed out, I think, in the divided line, that this kind of demonstrative reasoning begins with assumptions, namely various kinds of axioms. And of course, also assumes the various rules of derivation and the like. And for that reason, it really does not provide the kind of certainty we require to be sure of obtaining truth in the full-blown sense of the term. And I think it's in that respect that there's a notion that we have to get at what is beyond all assumption. And I think that is endemic to the autonomy that philosophers, shall we say, invoke in attempting to not operate with unexamined dogma. But the question is, what does it mean to get at what is beyond all assumption? For Plato in the Republic, at least in the voice of Socrates, we arrive at, in a sense, a kind of first principle, the good, which is identified as being beyond all assumption. But what is regarded to be beyond all assumption or presuppositionless is precisely that which cannot rest upon anything else, but that which everything else rests upon. So it has these dual characteristics as being that which we have to know to really know about everything else in an unconditioned manner. We have to know about that which is not conditioned or relative to anything else, but is determinative of everything else. And it's ascribed, in a sense, two characteristics that pertain to a first principle in general. It is first, that is, it is not derived from anything else, it is not mediated by anything else, it is immediate, and it is determinative of everything else. It is a foundation. It is a particular content that has this exclusive privilege of being determinative of anything else that can be or be known. And to some degree, this goes along with the talk of getting at the nature of things, as opposed to, let's say, subscribing to convention. Because convention is conditioned. It's a matter of what a community wills. But we want to get at what is by nature, in the sense of being not contingent to any determiner, shall we say. But in a sense, nature has a given determinacy in being opposed to that which is conventional. And you have, in this search for presuppositionlessness that takes the form of trying to arrive at first principles, an endorsement of, as I was sort of intoning in this paper, this idea that what is immediate, absolutely immediate, could be determinate in two respects. It has some kind of specification. It's not indeterminate. And it also has the character of being a determiner of everything else. But alas, there have been all sorts of competitors, right, in the annals of philosophers who attempt to locate a first principle of different competing candidates. And the problem is, you can't deduce the first principle from anything else. You also are not really in a position to be able to show that everything else derives from it, because you have to make appeal to what everything else is, as if you could somehow determine that in a way independently of the first principle, to try to show that the first principle, in a sense, fulfills the duty it's cracked up to be able to fulfill. So the whole enterprise of legitimating first principles, I think, is inherently problematic. And I think part of this is exhibited in what Aristotle tries to do in regard to the first principle of reason. And
Okay, sorry.
Hegel, I think, is departing from that. Few others have departed from that view.
Okay, given the time, I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to say what they want to say mainly. I think I'm going to not have follow-ups until everyone's spoken. Okay, so I'll put you on the queue, Paul, if you want to come back. Greg.
Thanks, Richard, for your talk. Yeah, I just have a couple questions about Hegel. One of the questions is about the distinction between contrariety and contradiction in Hegel. I'm just wondering to what extent you think there is a distinction there, or whether you think Hegel doesn't have such a robust distinction between these two kinds of opposition. So I think very rightly you pointed out in the discussion of contradiction, right, that the negative is the specific other of the positive. And so that might, for readers in the history of philosophy, may think, well, is Hegel there talking about contrariety? And then is it out of some kind of contrariety that contradiction arises? So I'm just curious, maybe you could say something, what your thoughts are about that. So that's my first question, a very open question about contrariety and contradiction in Hegel. And then I had of course, I agree with your reading of the logic and your argument that really it's wrong to overplay the Aristotle and Hegel. I think there's a lot of Aristotle there, but I think it can be overplayed. But I wanted to ask you about the status of these. They appear like they're contradictions. Being is nothing, nothing is being. But like you pointed out, there's no determinations there. And so the principle of we can't say that they're consistent determinations because there's no determinations. But equally, it doesn't seem that we can say that they're inconsistent determinations because we don't have determinations yet, right? So of course the PNC doesn't apply yet, but also at the same time, someone could say there are no inconsistencies yet either, because there are no determinations to be inconsistent with each other. So one thing that I'd like to ask is whether you think at some point in the logical development, we get to a stage where we can retroactively see that being, nothing, becoming are all separate categories. Each is a distinct category, and yet being and nothing are the same, even though they're different categories. Is there a point at which we can retroactively look back and see that there is contradiction there at those initial stages? Or is, so those are my two questions. Yeah.
I don't know if you really want to apply the term contradiction there in the sense in which Hegel is speaking about it as a formal determination in the logic of essence. Look, becoming presents, you could say, although again, these terms are not really properly applicable, the identity and difference of being and nothing.
Yeah.
Because they are immediately distinguished and immediately at one.
Yeah. And
they're immediately distinguished because there's nothing with which you can distinguish themselves from one another. There's no factor that is the basis of their difference. And in a sense, you might ask, well, why? Why is there nothing as well as being? Well, there is no answer to be given. Because if there were an answer, the emergence would be mediated. There'd be something that would cause it or account for it or whatever, but there isn't. And there can't be. And one shouldn't be shocked by that. One shouldn't be bothered by that. You're asking for something that violates what's going on. Now, I think when you're talking about consistency, you're really talking about something that obviously is a very formal determination, right? Something is consistent by, in a sense, being self-identical. And that self-identity is an identity of an extremely empty formal self, whose content could be anything whatsoever. Whereas when we talk about a self-determining self, a self in the true sense, unlike substance, we're talking about something whose determinations are part of its very identity. And they're not, let's say, like the accidents of substance, because the unity of the self is a unity that differentiates itself, that determines itself. And for that reason, consistency does not apply in a formal way, because the subject, in a sense, is what it determines itself to be, and what it is what it determines itself to be. That is its very identity. It gives itself its identity. It is what it determines itself to be. So we're dealing with, you know, a different framework. And I think when Hegel introduces contradiction, where he does in the Logic of Essence as something following from identity, which is an internal difference, it's completely formal, which for that reason involves diversity, because to be self-identical involves a content, but the content is a matter of indifference. So it automatically involves diverse entities that are self-identical, a kind of opposition. And then, well, one would have to go into the nuts and bolts and see how that opposition, in a sense, gives rise to polarity, positive and negative relationship, and how that becomes contradictory. I mean, initially it is not, but it becomes, in its own working out, it ends up undermining itself and presenting us with what could be called contradiction. And again, contradiction that has that very formal character that the principle of contradiction carries with it.
So, Richard, do you want to?
No, it figures in a very specific arena pertaining to a specific kind of entities that involve contradiction. You know, it's not as if all the other terms that are going to involve negation involve contradiction. I don't think we want to just globally associate this term contradiction with all of the various categorizations in which you have, in various ways, unifications of something and the negation of something in various manners.
So, Richard, do you want to take up Greg's first question about contradiction and contrariety explicitly?
Well, again, I think if you want to ask, where does Hegel discuss contrariety? I mean, again, it depends what exactly you mean by contrariety. I mean, and Aristotle has a very specific meaning, and it's connected to substance. And you know, it's that involves, you know, something that has a more concrete character than what is simply merely self-identical, and the diversity of things that are self-identical. So I don't think it maps on directly there. You know, there are kinds of contrariety. I mean, you know, that can have a dynamic character or not. I think it gets rather complicated.
Okay, everything in Hegel gets complicated. That's absolutely right. Michaela.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting and helpful. I have a question about a little detail. In the central part of your paper, you show how the dialectic of being and nothing challenges the principle of no contradiction. And then you mention the dialectic of something another. And you say you showed how the dialectic of something another and then determinacy challenges the principle of non-contradiction. Yeah. But I was thinking about that specific place in the logic, the dialectic of something another, the way in which something and other are both something and other. Seems to they seem to be, each one is both something and other, but seems to be on the point of view of an external reflection, and so under different respects. And so I was wondering if that dialectic really challenges the law of non-contradiction, and I'm not sure it does, especially because we are still something and other are basically, as far as I understood the passage, of the calm result of the dialectic of being and nothing, and it's still a static relation between something and other, which further on gets developed in the dialectic of the limits and the finite, where the contradictory character of determinacy gets really is made explicit. But I don't understand in which sense there is a contradictory tension between something and other. Could you say something more about this, please? And thank you.
I don't want to say it's contradictory. What I do want to say in that whole development is that we here have an account of determinacy, of the constitution of determinacy, that in no way depends upon the principle of contradiction. And in fact, it cannot, because we're not talking about things being determinate because they have attributes of any sort whatsoever. We're talking about the determinacy of determinacy itself, which is something really prior to being able to talk about a thing with properties or something with attributes and the like. And something doesn't have any attributes either. Something is just a determinate determinacy. So the account of them showing how you get to them, in a sense, refutes the claim that determinacy depends upon the principle of contradiction. Because here we see, which obviously would beg the question, because here we see how it, we have an account of determinacy that does not appeal to any determinacies. And then when you get to something another, you know, there's certain people like Derrida, basing himself to some degree on Saussure, who wants to say that the contrast of something another is ultimately the basis of all meaning. It depends upon this. And that for this reason, you know, meaning has this endless dissemination. Because what is something? Something is, in a sense, what it is not. It depends on the specification of its other, but its other is something only in not being what is its other, et cetera, et cetera. So you get this endless dissemination. But in a way, one way of kind of short-circuiting the development that follows from something another is to see that indeed, not through an external reflection, but through the relation of something another, they both play both roles simultaneously, right? Something is something in not being its other. Its other is also an other in being a something that has an other confronting it. So in a sense, it turns out that although they depend upon their contrastive being, determinate being, by being not what their other is, they end up having the same determination. Something and other are both something and other. And in that way, as a development will work itself out through a lot of variations I'm not going to speak about, you get determinacy reverting to self-relation, where something is determinate not in relationship to anything distinct from itself. And that comes through, in a way, something and other, through their own workings out, in a way, eliminating their distinction. And then you have the one, which is pretty empty. The only thing that can be contrasted to the one is the void, which is the absence of something. But the void, of course, is no different from the one. So we get the many, and we're off into quantity, which is in this unity of continuity and discreteness, which the many present. But sort of that's sort of what works out, not through external reflections, but through what these determinations are in their own right. And that in a way, I think indicates that the notion that meaning is based upon dissemination doesn't make sense, because it never arrives at any individuation. You can't achieve individuation through the relation of something another. It's ultimately going to require conceptual determination and the way in which universality, particularity, and individuality are interconnected.
Okay, Elena.
Thank you, Richard, for your talk. I liked the historical reconstruction of Aristotle's, Sextus and Kant's points of view. But I perhaps I missed the part about Sextus Empiricus, and I wanted to know more about your take on Hegel's interpretation of Pyrrhonian skepticism and of Hegel's interpretation of the skeptical principle, panti logo, logos isos antiquitae. What do you think about it? Is Hegel, you seem to suggest that there is a way in which Hegel is against skepticism and the skeptical principle. But perhaps I missed it. Perhaps I just...
Yeah. I mean, the crux of what Hegel's objection would be, and I'm not here referring to his discussions and his lectures on the history of philosophy, but I'm thinking more about the fundamental arguments he's making in logic and phenomenology of spirit. The ancient skeptics are not skeptical enough because they subscribe to the principle of non-contradiction. That's the basis of their entire activity, which consists of exposing contradictions, and once they've exposed contradictions, of regarding them as indicating that we're dealing with something where we can't make any truth claim, that instead we have to suspend judgment. And that is based upon, in a sense, this, you could say maybe surreptitious acceptance that we can't allow anything to violate the principle of contradiction. If we find contradictions, that does not mean that there is a true combination of contradictory either claims or determinations. That cannot be. Why can't it be? Well, one that, Sextus and the rest, they presuppose the authority of the principle of contradiction. Even though they themselves, obviously, as skeptics, are not in a position to legitimate it without violating their own credo. I think that's the problem. That's the problem with the skeptics. And I think it's very interesting if you read Sextus Empiricus, not so much the parts where he's discussing how various kinds of claims are relative to the character of the knower, to the relation of the knower to the object, or to the condition of the object, but focus on how he deals with the arguments of the dogmatists, in particular Aristotle, and tries to show that we encounter contradictory determinations. In many respects, the contradictory determinations that Sextus will expose will be, in a way, affirmed by Hegel and embraced as aspects of what it is that is on the table. And that doesn't mean that we are falsely conceiving what's on the table when we find these oppositions. That they are ingredient in what we're addressing.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I completely agree.
I'll give you one important example just now, very quickly. When I was discussing how Hegel makes the transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept, and does it by way of reciprocity as something that the relations of causality end up reverting into. Sextus Empiricus says very similar things in trying to point out that the whole idea of causality affirmed by dogmatic philosophers is contradictory, by showing up that, look, the cause is only a cause when it has an effect. The effect thereby is really the cause. The cause ends up just being an effect. And this Sextus will regard as being something that will expose how we have to suspend judgment on causality, because it has this kind of contradictory character. But Hegel regards it as indeed endemic to causality, and that's what makes it impossible to regard causality as an ultimate determination.
Okay, good. So we've been around the table once, and that's great. We have 15 minutes left, so we've got time for a few follow-ups. If you want to follow up, put your hand up. But Greg, is there stuff on YouTube that people have been putting in?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me to check. 1 second. Let me take a look here at this. Yes, there is a question. Can I go ahead and read it?
Please.
Okay, so this is from Levin. He says, what is your take on the question, if Hegel's absolute is contradictory, and how do you relate it to statements concerning the sublation of the contradiction in the third moment of the dialectic, paragraph 83. So should I read that again, or is that okay?
I guess so. I mean, I don't, I guess, you know, I'm reluctant to speak about there being a dialectic that has three moments, because it sort of suggests that Hegel has a method. There's a dialectical method that, in other words, there's a formal logical dimension to Hegel's philosophizing, which I don't think there is. Now, admittedly, at the very end of the logic, the way in which the logic comes to closure involves the manner in which what it is indeed that which has come to be through all the preceding determinations, and indeed incorporates them as constitutive of itself. And this involves a kind of retrospective ordering that he will speak of in terms of the way in which the concept develops, in terms of the categories of universality, particularity, and individuality. But again, I don't think that's equivalent to a formal logic, because here it's going to incorporate the content with itself.
Okay, let me
and likewise, when you talk about the absolute, I'm reluctant to speak about the absolute as an absolute, because I think the logic comes to closure, but that's not an absolute in the sense of the divine or everything that is or anything of that sort. It's rather, shall we say, the totality of conceptual determination, categorical determination.
Okay, let me push the question a bit further, Richard.
Okay.
What Hegel certainly does say explicitly is that at a certain stage, contradictions are aufgehoben. And a lot of people read that as an appeal to the principle of non-contradiction, getting rid of the contradiction. And I think what the question was asking you was about what do you want to say about that?
Well, again, it depends upon what you mean by contradiction. If you mean by contradiction, the specific process that in a way is identified by the principle of contradiction and exhibited in the account of contradiction given in the logic of essence, there we're dealing with the way in which a certain kind of opposition undermines itself, and it's a very formal opposition. And certainly when one comes to other kinds of determinations, in particular those that are conceptual, those of the logic of the concept, those that involve self-determination, you know, we're beyond those kind of formal contradictions. So in that regard, we're entering a new domain, which is one that is what it is by incorporating those preceding domains. I'll say it in a very simple way. You know, the logic of self-determination is not something that can operate, let's say, immediately. It can't be where one begins, because self-determination involves determinacy. And you can't account for determinacy unless you start with indeterminacy, and the logic of being provides determinacy. But you can't have self-determination unless you have determination, which involves a determiner and what is determined. And the logic of essence provides us with the categorization of all the forms that two-tiered structure of categorical determination can take. And that provides the basis for self-determination. In fact, it converts itself into self-determination when the determiner and determined can no longer be distinguished through reciprocity. So I think in this respect, one is moving beyond contradiction in various ways. And I don't think you want to identify contradiction with negation, for example. Negation is present throughout insofar as there's determination. There's a different kind of negation that's involved when you have determined determinacy. Hegel will point out that in a sense, if you want to speak about what's involved in the whole logic of essence, you not only have determinacy, but the immediacy of determinacy is negated. So you have a second level of negation where what is determined by essence or some determiner, it has a determinacy, it is other to something, but it also doesn't have an independent being. It is determined by something from which it derives its determinacy. And then that relationship becomes negated when we come to self-determination, because the immediacy of the determiner is eliminated. The determiner is what it determines itself to be. It's sort of self-mediated.
Okay, Greg, are there any more questions on YouTube?
Let me see. And that is all for now.
Okay, so we've got two hands, Stefan and Tobias. We've got just under 10 minutes left, so let's get both in. So please make questions and answers as focused as possible so we can get both in. Tobias first.
Well, thank you. This question of sublimation in the absolute gives me the opportunity to go back to my first question. And you said that God makes no explicit appearance in the science of logic. And I think I'm not convinced, I must say, because I think it's more that he kind of deconstructs what the traditional rational theology does. So therefore, he does not prove God as positivity. God is not a given. Yeah, God is not in that sense a being, but it's a negative. God is proven as a negativity. So it is something that we have to give. So he kind of stresses the idea of the reciprocity of the finite and the divine. And therefore, I think the absolute is contradictory because it's dependent as the absolute from something which is not. So this tension, I think this is what he explicitly deals with. So I think this makes more sense to put it that way. So this is more like a critique instead of a question, because I don't find it very helpful to think of all these appearances of God as just a metaphorical way of speaking. So yeah, sorry, this is rather a command than a question, but yeah.
Well, you know, you referred to the contrast between the finite and what is not finite. Now, of course, Hegel takes this up in the Logic of Being. In a sense, he speaks about the finite and how determinacy is, in a sense, entails finitude, because since determinacy is something in contrast to what is other, determinacy can't help having its end added in itself. It terminates, it comes to an end. It has a limit, et cetera, et cetera. But what's beyond the limit, which is necessarily entailed by its own finitude, is the non-finite. But the non-finite, again, is not attributed to God, although there are certain conceptions of God that treat God as if he were the non-finite, such as Yahweh or Allah, where the non-finite does not contain the finite, but the non-finite that doesn't contain the finite ends up being finite because it has a limit. So the true infinite has to be something that contains both the finite and the non-finite. Now, of course, you could say that, okay, that's something to be found in certain religious traditions, such as also by the same token, Hegel will speak about nothing as being something that pertains to Buddhism, in effect, which regards what is unconditioned as having to be indeterminate, and thereby being nothing ultimately, because anything that's determinate is relative and conditioned and so forth and so on. You know, so you, again, as I see it, we have all sorts of categories that do play a role in various theological traditions, religious traditions. And likewise, when Hegel talks about the absolute, he's talking about the absolute to begin with in the logic of essence in a way that in a sense sort of applies to the kind of, you could say, first and only principle that you find in Spinoza, the one and only substance. Of course, there are some who said that Spinoza was an atheist because everything is God, you know, you have, and then it's not clear, you don't have any transcendence, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it's presented, that absolute is not Hegel's absolute. It's something that would be left behind, it can't be ultimate, et cetera. So here you have these various categories that have been made use of in religious representation. and in argument by those philosophers who've come to the aid of religious traditions to try to rationally legitimate their doctrines. But I think Hegel is not adding that extra element that allows us to say, okay, we're talking about God, or the gods, or however one wants to think about the divine.
Okay, Stefan, last question.
Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, then you think Aristotle and Sextus Empiricus and the skeptics, they were wrong because they presupposed the law of contradiction, and for an autonomous subject or rationality, there can be no presupposition. And so I think you're correct, and this is an issue for the beginning of logic. But this doesn't mean that, or would you say this implies that he then in the end says the law of non-contradiction is not valid? Because he doesn't want to become a romantic who thinks there are no rules and the poetic genius has complete freedom and can do whatever she wants. He doesn't like the romantics very much because he thinks there the subject becomes the absolute. And so I think he still accepts rules in a way, but they must be rules who are evolved within logic itself. And this would also be true, I guess, for the law of non-contradiction. But this would not mean that the law of non-contradiction is not valid anymore, or that it's not an issue at all. It just would say, okay, you cannot presuppose it in logic. So what would you say?
The autonomy of reason, like the autonomy of conduct, is not something indeterminate. It's not a matter of thinking as you please or doing as you please, right? It ends up having a determinate structure, or I should say a determinate process, you might say, because autonomous reason is what it determines itself to be. Autonomous agents determine themselves in and through their conduct. And, but what they determine themselves to be cannot be what it is to be determined by a formal logical structure, because that is something that only applies to something that is externally determined and whose content is a matter of indifference. But that's not the nature of self-determination. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why artificial intelligence cannot deal with conceptual determination, because it's not formal in character. The particular is, in a sense, determined in and through the universal. The universal is not empty. And you can't get at it through algorithms, which is what artificial intelligence depends upon. So, but there's another side to it. It's not just a question of escaping from presuppositions. It's also the point that determinacy is independently of the principle of non-contradiction. It doesn't depend upon it. You can't account for it on that basis. And when you really try to face up to accounting for determinacy, you see that the way it can only be constituted cannot involve any invocation of the principle of non-contradiction, because you have nothing that principle can apply to in the process where determinacy is established. And I think that has ramifications for the arguments of Aristotle and that of Sextus Empiricus. And I think, despite the fact that Aristotle will invoke various kinds of self-moving or something approaching freedom, autonomy of reason, in some respect, the self-moving character of nature, maybe in particular animals and mind, he ends up always reverting, in a sense, to categories of techne, where form is imposed upon something, often. So you really can't have political self-determination. You have rulers rotating and exercising their craft upon others. In De Anima, you have the active intellect acting upon the passive intellect. In discussing the motion of animals, there's always one part of the animal that's acting upon another part. You never have self-determination proper. And it may be that the adherence to the principle of non-contradiction plays a role in preventing Aristotle from being able to think self-determination.
Okay, good. Well, that's 10 o'clock, so that we should wind up. So let us thank Richard again very much, especially for stepping in at such short notice. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for your questions.
Thanks for stepping in.
Next time.
And we'll see people again next week.
Great.
Have a safe week.
Bye.
Take care.